Deltarune so far has followed three core narrative pillars: the illusion of choice, finding one's true self, and of course, freedom. But do these narrative pillars apply to the lesser-known story in Deltarune, most commonly referred to as the Weird Route? So let's break down each of the narrative pillars that can be found within the Weird Route and maybe even talk about where the Weird Route might be leading. So, before I dive into each of the narrative pillars of the Weird Route, you might be watching this video and wondering what the Weird Route even is. Or maybe you know just the highlights and, the main details of what happens in the Weird Route. Which is understandable, because some of the stuff that you have to do to even begin the Weird Route is really obscure. And even darker than that, some of the things that you do while you're on the Weird Route are quite disturbing. I would even argue that it's worse than the Genocide Route found in Undertale. So with that being said, what exactly is the Weird Route? Well, to put it bluntly, the Weird Route is where you use a character named Chris to manipulate their childhood best friend Noelle into murdering / incapacitating one of their friends, Birdly, only then to later presumably manipulate and break their minds yet again by forcibly equipping an item onto them, whose purpose we don't technically know at this moment, but it can be assumed based on the actions that we've committed thus far to get to that point. These actions seem to have insane impacts on the different characters within the world, but it doesn't seem to have direct impacts on the core narrative of Deltarune thus far. And with that being said, what about the narrative pillars? Well, to understand how the narrative pillars present themselves within the Weird Route, we're just gonna have to break down how the Weird Route happens within each chapter. And in that comparison, you will hopefully see that the Weird Route is expressing the exact same narrative pillars that are done in the normal route, just in its own weird and twisted way. Okay, yes, I know I said we would break down each chapter, and there's 4 chapters in Deltarune, but nothing really affecting the Weird Route happens in Chapter 1. The only thing that you can really do that's kinda weird is that if you decide to fight everybody instead of becoming all their friends, you have a different ending at the end of the chapter where instead of the king getting overthrown by all the different subjects, you have the king randomly falling asleep. I think Ralsei did it because they have the pacifist powers, right? And they were trying to ensure that the story ended the same. But regardless, you close the Dark Fountain and the game ends the same. Nothing particularly important to note there, other than it kind of touches on that first narrative pillar that, ultimately your choices don't matter. But enough about Chapter 1, we're here to talk about the Weird Route, and that starts in Chapter 2. So like I just said, you can only start the Weird Route in Chapter 2 after you fight Birdly for the first time with Queen, and you have Barney steal away your friendly neighborhood femboy away from you. And once you're alone, you actually run into Noelle and you make a truce with her not to rat her out to the Queen, and then you do a double truces with the Queens and not rat her out to Birdly. And then they talk about having no triple truces. It's quite entertaining. But at the end of the day, you end up teaming up with Noelle, and unfortunately, this is where the fun ends. From this point, you have to take Noelle and hunt down basically every enemy in the area and in the previous area, which is kind of hard to miss, by the way, if you're trying to do the Weird Route. And you progressively command her to freeze all the different enemies until the area around you becomes progressively more eerie and desolate. And then eventually you go talk to some of the only people left in the area, the Addisons, and you get the freeze ring. And even in the process of buying said freeze ring, Noelle is protesting that you even get it in the first place and insisting that, you don't have this weird relationship with her that Chris, or you, the character or player, is insinuating. And once you have that ring, you continue to freeze more and more enemies and let Noelle get stronger and stronger. And during this whole time, you interact with different things like this Ferris wheel part. You have really weird and off-putting dialogue between you and Noelle and different responses that you can have with her. You will find a dumpster with Spamton inside of it where you can buy the Thorn Ring. And finally, once you have the Thorn Ring, you encounter Birdly. This fight is just so off-putting, and, for all the right reasons. That's like the whole goal of the Weird Route, right? Is to make you feel uncomfortable and like what you're doing is wrong. And you progressively pressure Noelle to proceed as you build up all the TP and magic. You just continually get to see her protest until she finally, unfortunately, gives in to your demands and does the unthinkable. entire process is obviously commentary on the third narrative pillar, freedom. You, the player, are forcing Chris and Noelle to commit unspeakable acts that they would never commit on the normal route, or even just as them themselves if they had their own autonomy. Feels like it flips the concept of freedom on its head from the normal route, where it's like you, the player, is seeking freedom in a weird and messed up way. And to what extent will you, the player, go to, and what will you sacrifice in the name of freedom? And in that same vein, it begs so many questions to be asked. Like, why would you as the player, other than maybe morbid curiosity, would want to even do the weird route? Is there something that happens at the end of the normal route that the prophecy foretells that is just that terrible that you're willing to put characters like this through so much suffering just to get a different outcome? And other than the bit in chapter 3, what would make the character even want to even explore trying to do different routes in the first place? And not only do those concepts play on freedom, but they also play on that illusion of choice narrative pillar, because as we currently know it, it doesn't matter what we do, it's gonna end all the same. Even in this chapter, when you do commit the weird route, the chapter does ultimately end the same, despite the castle being taken over by Spampton Neo and you having to do a crazy fight with him that's like way harder than his normal route fight. But I mean, ultimately, despite everything in the chapter ends the same once you get back to the overworld, right? Okay, so the idea that the ending is entirely the same is not exactly accurate. I mean, Deltarune seems to be very flexible with the terms that your choices don't matter, because they've obviously mattered to some people. But it does seem that in terms of the prophecy, nothing is really appearing to change. Because ultimately, even if you did or didn't freeze Mordecai over here, this chapter also ends basically the same way once you're in the light world. Yes, there are things that get affected in later chapters, but I think that's better saved for our discussion of chapter 4. Okay, so in chapter 3, there's actually nothing you have to do to continue the weird route in this area, but there's also some key and minor dialogue differences throughout this chapter as well, if you did the weird route in chapter 2. Such as some dialogue with Eram at the end of the sword route, where they talk about how they know what you did, and they say, oh, but you can kind of pawn that off on other people, Chris. You didn't actually commit those acts, right? But then they almost like tease them, because it's been hinted at that Chris has a really messed up past and that they've committed some sort of sin. I mean, this is a small but brief conversation, but it really plays upon that second narrative pillar about one's true self. Because I can only imagine if you're Chris and you've, committed these unspeakable acts, even if it was some sort of, ungodly deity controlling you, it would start to really blur the lines of what actions are truly yours and what aren't. And another detail that changes in this scene is where Ralsei asks Chris about the festival, and if you respond that you want to go with Noelle, they actually say that's like a terrible idea and that you probably shouldn't. Just to brush it off in the next line saying, oh, but Susie will be there, so it should be good. But then it just makes me want to ask a million more questions, like why does Ralsei even know that it's a bad idea? I mean, is time loop theory real? Has Ralsei been through all this before? I mean, I don't know. It's quite strange. Otherwise, we could dive into the rabbit hole that is the sword route, but I'll save that for another video, and if that sounds interesting to you and how we can talk about the narrative themes that are found within the sword route itself, go ahead and leave a comment and like and subscribe down below, and maybe if we hit 5,000 subs, I'll make that video. Chapter 4 has some of the largest and arguably most consequential moments of the weird route. So much so that I would almost argue that this part of the chapter is a turning point that you really can't go back once you've done what you've done. So most of the actions that you continue the weird route actually come in Noelle's house. But there are a couple of things noteworthy that happen outside of the house that I want to talk about really quick. Like when you have to go and get information about the bunker in the church, you have to talk to Rudy instead of Noelle this time, because Noelle just straight up won't want to talk to you about it and wants to talk to you about what happened last night. But it does make Noelle a little bit more forthcoming and asking Susie over on a study date and asking you to also third wheel with them. But it is followed up with Susie being left hanging, which really hurts. Come on, Chris. Give him a high five, come on. And then if you go to the hospital, you can actually visit Birdley, which thank God he's not dead, at least as far as we know, but they are in a comatose state where they feel incredibly cold and you have the option to actually like warm them up if you want. I didn't warm them up. I'm sorry, Mordecai. But an even more interesting detail from the hospital scene is that there's a missing blue bead off of the toy at the front of the office. And it just, it's like, oh, Berdley's not going to be a part of this adventure anymore moving forward. It's really unfortunate. And an example of that can be seen in Noelle's house. One of the first things that ends up being different in the weird route in chapter 4 is Noelle actually gets a call from her mom instead of Berdley. And it is this call that allows you to explore the house, and everything else proceeds as normal. Chris rips you out, they put you in a box, blah 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 blah. Except on the way to put you in said box, Noelle intercepts you and says, "I need to really talk to you about what happened last night." Which is curious because we, the player, at this point know nothing about this. So once you are in just your soul form, you can actually go to Noelle's room and you see Chris and Noelle talking about what happened last night. How Chris actually went and visited Noelle and removed the thorn from them, and also reassured them that the actions and things that happened in chapter 2 were merely just a dream. They continue to talk until finally there's a prompted response, which allows you to kind of get into the room and possess Chris. So the dialogue options get more and more disturbing until you get to a point where you're just mashing proceed over and over again until you finally proceed. So the cutscene you just watched was interpreted a lot of different ways, but I think the most obvious thing in this scene represents is that the player is removing Noelle's autonomy by inserting either a soul or some sort of method of control over them. And I mean, this scene and basically the entire route really hits on all three narrative pillars. I mean, it flips the first narrative pillar on its head, the illusion of choice, because Chris did all these actions and things to try and avoid this very thing from happening after they saw what we were doing in chapter 2. All for it to become true anyways because we, the player, forced it to be that way. Next is a continuation of the narrative pillar of one's true self, with Chris becoming increasingly adversarial with us and just beating the ever-living shit out of us in the bathroom in that trash can bit, even though it technically causes damage to themselves, which I'm sure can be interpreted as an allegory for self-hate in some capacity, right? I mean, I'm sure Chris in this moment knows that it's the player, this deity, that is making them commit these atrocities, but at the same time, I can only imagine Chris's mental, where again, that line of what actions they are committing and what you're committing as the player are just increasingly getting blurrier and blurrier, and Chris's inability to stop us from doing these things, even though they tried their hardest, I'm sure that comes with some sort of sense of guilt, right? And then there's the question of Noelle's freedom because of the manipulation that you've been doing in the body of Chris to try and make her do all these horrible acts, along with the fact that we might be controlling them literally or severing Noelle's control of their body or themselves in the next chapter. And to continue on the freedom narrative pillar, I feel like the Weird Route as a whole is a massive commentary on the narrative of freedom within Deltarune. Because like I said earlier, why would we as the player decide to do this route? It is absolutely atrocious, some of the acts that you were committing in this. I mean, I just can't see it right now because we don't know the end of the game, but it has to be more than just morbid curiosity, right? Like, what happens at the end of the normal route that is so bad that this is a viable alternative? I mean, I could only speculate that the normal route has to have some sort of enormous sacrifice, even, if you do all the things to try to prevent that. But I suppose the Weird Route could also just be commentary on how people try to find weird and messed up things within video games, even though it's at the expense of the characters that you're playing, even if it's not meant to be, I mean, in the Spamton newsletter, you had the whole thing with Noelle and having this whole side of her that loved doing that kind of stuff and finding glitches in games and weird creepypasta-esque routes. But at the end of the day, I suppose none of these questions will be answered until we have the release of all of Deltarune. But I'm sure we'll learn a ton more in Chapter 5, and I'm excited to talk about it once that day comes. But in the meantime, go ahead and leave a comment down below about what you think the Weird Route is leading up to. And as always, thank you so much for watching.